we're in this machine that has a certain way of functioning. And what people in the degrowth and postgrowth camp, which I certainly am in, are saying is we need to change the machine. We can't keep going with this one. But I am very much persuaded that another world is out there that we could manage very, very differently, with more prosperity, better health, and without destroying our life conditions with the planet.
Welcome to Beyond the Fix. This is a podcast that takes a closer look at the solutions that science and technology aim to offer to today's most pressing problems. In this episode, we're diving into the concept of green growth. Green growth aims to fix the problems of our current economy that is unsustainable and damaging to the planet we all live on. The vision for a circular economy is to halt the excessive consumption of natural resources while still allowing for economic growth. If that sounds like a win-win, but also a bit contradictory, this episode is for you. We'll explore the idea of decoupling economic growth from environmental impact, discuss why economic growth is considered essential for modern nations, and examine what alternatives to our current self-destructive system might look like. I'm your host, Thomas Kobel, and I'm excited to discuss these issues with my guest, Julia Steinberger. Julia is a professor of ecological economics at the University of Lausanne in Switzerland, and actually a physicist by training. This is maybe why she adopts perspective that to some in the field of economics sound like blasphemy. I'm sure she can tell us more about this in a second. I'm glad you've made time for this. Welcome to the show, Julia Steinberger.
Thanks, it's lovely to be here. Thanks, Thomas.
So, to kick things off and get to know you better, how does someone who earns a PhD in physics at MIT transition into the field of environmental economics?
Well, it's actually ecological economics, which turns out to be different. But it's a typical academic thing. Two things that sound the same and would mean the same thing to the normal people mean totally different camps in academia. So maybe that's something we should talk about.
Yeah, go ahead.
So transitioning from physics to ecological economics is not hard at all, because a lot of the founding figures in ecological economics, which tends to look at the economy as embedded in the environment and how it uses resources and energy and exchanges with the environment, those are all really basic things that physicists really love to think about. And so ecological economics has always had lots of physicists, in particular Bob Ayres, or I think Kenneth Golding was another one. And to this day, a lot of people come from physics or from engineering into ecological economics. Environmental economics, however, tends to take the ideas of mainstream economics much more to heart and keep them much more, and has a view of economic functioning separate from the environment to the extent that you solve environmental issues via mainstream economic methods. That is not something that ecological economics does. And I would say that transition is probably a lot harder because you're really trying to enter a field of mainstream economics with all the baggage that comes with that.
So I've heard you describe your approach as heterodox economics.
Yeah.
What's different in this perspective?
Okay, we're getting into it. So heterodox economics is, it's sort of like the little village in Asterix and Obelix and the Romans, right? So the little village of Asterix and Obelix is sort of resisting and trying to preserve some diversity of society and ways of thought. And I think that this is what heterodox economics tries to do. I think that ecological economics is aligned with heterodox economics to a large extent. It isn't really part of it. But heterodox economics basically represents the whole spectrum of ideas that treats economics like a social science, not just like a quantitative math game, and is critical of some of the basic fundamentals of mainstream economics, including notions of equilibrium, trying to forget notions of power relations. So there's all kinds of problems with mainstream economics and its basic assumptions. And what heterodox economics is doing is it's bringing lots of other ideas to the fore, including ideas from social science and political science around power relations, around different abilities to make decisions in economic systems. Whether you're a producer, a large industry, or a consumer or worker, you're going to have different levels of power. So it's really trying to keep some of the ideas from those fields, including areas of Marxian economics. So Marx's idea around how history happens and how capitalism works and how this involves class conflict. Those are part of heterodox economics. Other ideas of heterodox economics are around the importance of institutional economics. Keynesian and post-Keynesian ideas are in heterodox economics. So it's a big tent.
So how do colleagues from mainstream economics, I don't know if you call them colleagues, but
Yeah.
how do they respond to your ideas? Or is there any sort of conversation between these economics?
So it really depends on the department and the atmosphere at the university. In some universities, there's much more of a clash that I've had experience with. And in some universities, it's much more collegial. And even if we don't agree on everything, we still work together on projects. So I'm lucky enough that at the University of Leeds, where I was, it was quite collegial. And there were really wonderful colleagues in heterodox and Marxian economics to work with who were vital to everything that I'm doing now in terms of their collaboration and their ideas. And here in HEC at the University of Lausanne, they're not quite, I would say, as many heterodox economics or any heterodox economics colleagues. However, there are a lot of mainstream economics colleagues who are sort of interested in talking and working together. And so we do have collaborations. We're able to co-author papers. We're able to have big projects together. Right now, we have a big project on modeling how Switzerland could come, the policies and modeling for Switzerland to come within planetary boundaries. And that's very much a collaboration with colleagues from HEC and also the Department of Public Policy and Law.
So to me, this comes as a surprise that this is actually working, because to me, this sounds like two belief systems that are basically incompatible, right?
I think within mainstream economics, there's some people who are quite frustrated with their discipline's lack of vision and lack of engagement with current challenges. And so there are individual, not necessarily the whole field, but there are individual colleagues within the fields who really feel like they want to work and act on these things. And then they want to sort of say, oh, can we combine our methods? Can we combine our approaches? Let's see what we can do together. And I think curiosity is really the basis of any academic work. And so as long as we get along and we have some similar questions and it's nice to work with each other, then we can do it.
So you mentioned lack of vision, but has the field of economics as a discipline even played an active role in the developments that led us to our current situation?
I would argue yes. But I think that that's, again, there's different strains of it. And so I'm learning more about the history of neoliberalism and the Chicago School, and even going back before Milton Friedman to Friedrich Hayek and Ludwig von Mises and all of these things. So there's definitely a strain of economics that has very much pushed us in our current direction, because that strain of economics has been, in fact, very activist on the political side. So they accuse everybody else of being activists, but what they do is extraordinary. They've really shaped our societies and have wanted to shape our societies from a long way, including direct frontal attacks on democracy and democratic capacity for decision-making. That's really part of the neoliberal platform, trying to undo expert interference or guidance on things like climate, which is also extraordinary. So that strain of economics has very much aligned itself with powerful industry and has come to the fore thanks to those powerful industrial actors. So if you look at specific examples, like when they came to power in under Pinochet's takeover of Chile, that they did that because they were aligned with large multinationals involved in copper extraction and other mining, and that was how they sort of took over a country. And that's how they're operating, is they're operating very much in alliance. They're developing an ideology and methods that are in alliance with large extractive industries. And so I would say that certainly that part of economics has played a big role in getting us into the trouble we're in. I would say that the most of economics is not so extreme as these people who are really quite far out. I mean, they're dominant, but they're really sort of a fringe still. But I think that the rest of the mainstream economics profession has played a big role, not so much in what they're trying to push forward as what they're trying to not look at. And what they're trying not to look at and trying to not consider in their models are effectively power relations. That you have vast differential in the ability to shape markets from the side of multinational corporations and big companies who really shape the entire economy, the political system, the regulatory system, international exchanges, the laws, the binding laws of the World Trade Organization, and so on. So they're really shaping the whole economic system in order for their continued existence and profitability. When you don't look at that, when you refuse to look at that, and you maintain the fiction that free markets work perfectly with minimal interference, then what you're basically doing is really protecting those large industries and their ability to do whatever they want. And that has been our reality, I would say, for the last 50 to 60 years, is we've really been in systems that have been more and more and more dominated by these large industries and by our government's inability to regulate them. And economics has played a large role in pushing that view of the world away from us.
Yeah, I want to ask about that because you said they try not to look at it. That sounds like something very active, like that you have to avoid actively.
Yeah, well, I don't think it has to be that active. Basically, you have a frame of reference and a frame of methods that make you focus on representing the world a certain way, and that representation is absent of power relations. So as long as you stay within the frame, you're basically deciding that you're going to ignore those things. And I think that's a big problem. I have a colleague, Steve Keen, who has written a lovely book, Debunking Economics. One of the things he talks about is how the main axioms of economics are wrong. And every generation, some brave, enterprising young economist will prove that they're wrong, like with data and math and everything. And that work goes nowhere. So basically, everybody in economics kind of knows that all the axioms are wrong. But unlike physics, where when your axioms are wrong, you change your theory, the theory stays. And I think the reason the theory stays is because it's power adjacent, it's protective of power. And that allows economists and economics departments to have a very sort of protected and a privileged relation to government and to industry. And it's sort of convenient for everybody to keep this going. But it's not that the counterexamples or the evidence for the counterexamples don't exist, because as Steve Keen shows, like every 20 years or so, somebody will publish a paper saying, you know what, this cost supply curve doesn't work, and nobody cares.
But isn't that frustrating for you, especially as a trained physicist?
Oh, it's intensely frustrating, but I don't have to work with these people, you understand? I'm not in the same department.
But in the same, like you.
I get to do my own thing. I have freedom to do whatever I want. Okay. So if other people it's like the meme, somebody's wrong on the internet. If somebody's wrong on the internet, you don't have to make that your life goal to always correct them. So my priority has not been to try to fix other people's messes. My priority has been to advance my field of knowledge in the way that I think is the most interesting. And I can't help it if the dominant knowledge academic paradigm that we have is really quite flawed. Like that work has been done. Bob Ayers, for instance, one of the physicists who is a big founder of ecological economics, he spent so much of his career trying to get his papers published in mainstream economic journals, only to get rejected. And I saw that example. I didn't want to spend my time like that. I admire his effort, but that was not what I wanted to do. I wanted to be able to move forward in my life and not just constantly go up against a huge wall.
So let's now delve into the topic of green growth. Can you summarize what it involves and why it emerged?
So green growth has always been the dream. So the idea of green growth, and this goes back decades, so I can't tell you exactly when it came to the fore, but certainly as soon as sustainable development became a topic, in the early 1990s, this was very much the direction of sustainable development. So sustainable development, if you take it at its simplest form, is a green growth paradigm, because you're trying to keep the economy going, and that means growth in our current economies, and you're trying to reduce environmental pressures or environmental impacts, and that means reducing resource use or reducing impacts at the very least. And so basically what you're saying is the economy grows, the environmental impacts go down, and that's what you call green growth. That's what you call decoupling. You're basically saying the economy is on one trajectory and the environmental impacts are on another trajectory. That's the dream. Let's just do that dream thing. The problem with the dream is that it's not in reality so very much.
So let's talk about this decoupling, how this works in theory, because to me this sounds a bit like a perpetuum mobile, like it's a very nice idea. There must be a theory behind it which sounds plausible,
right? It's sort of these macro trajectories. So you're and decoupling, to be fair, decoupling can and does happen in some cases. Those cases are just not always the same. You can't apply the same thinking to every single environmental impact you have. So
do you have an example?
Yeah. There are some really good examples. And in fact, I have to pay homage to Kirk Smith, who was a beautiful colleague who worked in environmental health and risk management. And he was really a pioneer in this area. And he looked at environmental impacts through the lens of health, which is really important. So one of the things you can think of is in terms of environmental impacts, one of the first environmental impacts is sanitation. If you don't have sanitation, you die of waterborne disease, right? Because people are living in very unclean environments. And that's something that you can decouple very easily with technology, right? As soon as you have a sanitation system, which is something that everybody knows to do at this point, then you're decoupling that environmental impact. So you're preserving both human health and the environment by having a water sanitation system. So that's just one very simple example where with very little technology, you can, you can really do that decoupling quite easily. That's one kind. Another kind is around urban air pollution. So if you think of the early days of industrialization, you have these big smog surrounding all the major industrial cities because of all the coal burning and so on. And people have a very low life expectancy as a result. Everybody's basically dying of lung disease of various kinds. And that is something that you can decouple from economic activity by putting some filters on the smokestacks. And maybe your filters have to be more or less sophisticated in terms of all the things you're getting out. But it's something that you can do. So the thing is, we have examples of sort of what we call end of pipe, being able to clean up environmental impacts at end of pipe. So you have your economic activity, your industrial activity, and then you basically put a filter on it, put some sanitation, whatever, and your problem is solved. And the issue with this is that these are the environmental impacts that we had sort of early on, in early days of agriculture, in early days of industrialization. And the dream was that this could continue to be the case, that we would always have a simple, more or less simple technological solution. We just throw a filter on our society, and then the environment is fine. And all we need to do is develop and deploy the filter. And the problem with new kinds of environmental problems, which are the planetary boundary ones, we could call them, which constitute things like climate change, the planetary boundaries of nitrogen and phosphorus, for instance, land use, biodiversity loss. We have these sort of really macro messing with the living planet and its biogeochemical cycles. And these are not problems where it's easy to throw a filter on it. These are really problems of scale. They are not possible to solve cheaply by just like a small techno fix. And that means that we have to face the scale of our civilization, the scale of our societies, the scale of our economies, and we have to face the question of economic growth itself, because economic activity is accompanying these impacts. And we need to reduce scale, not just dream anymore.
So one example that pops out in my mind is renewable energy. Okay, solar energy, it has been scaled a lot. One could say this has the theoretical potential to substitute fossil energy. Why is this not going to work? I mean, or is this going to work?
So I think this is a really, really interesting case, and it's sort of emblematic of the issues here. So first of all, it can and will work, basically. So that's great news. However, there's a whole bunch of other questions around that. So one of the questions is the question of speed. If you're not reducing demand, if you're not managing energy demand downwards, the time it takes for renewables to substitute fossil fuels might take forever. It might take decades. It might take centuries, time we don't have in terms of keeping our temperature targets below what's safe for humanity, knowing that 2024 is already the year that we're breaching 1.5 degrees. Right? So the question of speed means you have to face the question of scale. It's a heck of a lot easier to reach 150, 200, 300 exajoules of renewable power generation than 600, right? So it's a question, this growth trajectory is really a problem there in terms of the speed at which we can substitute. Yeah. And right now, one of the things that's happening with renewable energy is that it's often additional. You're on a growth trajectory, so you have a new source. It's just adding to coal, gas, and oil. In some cases, it's substituting, but it would be far easier to substitute if we were drawing demand downwards. So that's one issue, is the issue of speed of substitution. The other issue is the issue of the perfection of a technology. No technology is perfect. Every technology has side effects. And for renewable energy, we're talking about a lot of minerals and metals being used, a lot of copper, a lot of neodymium, a lot of lithium for storage, for instance. And the more the scale of the economy requires these activities, the more we're talking about extraction and use of these minerals. In some cases, we have to wonder if we're going to be able to have enough minerals full stop. And that puts people in danger if you don't have enough. The other thing you have to wonder about is the living conditions and the environmental impacts of people close to these zones of extraction. And right now, for instance, there are plans to there's a lot of pressure for Serbia to open a big lithium mine, and the people in Serbia don't want that lithium mine because of the environmental impacts in an agricultural region that has a lot of population there, and that's being shoved under the green transition is green, and it's clean, but it's not. Lithium is an absolutely nasty, horrible substance to have mined. It's not like steel or anything like that. It's a lot worse in terms of how active it is in the environment and how toxic it is. So I think there's these real questions of like the scale of the economy sets the scale of the resource use, even the alternative green resource use. So since nothing is perfect, no technology is perfect, if via sufficiency measures or sobriety measures, whatever you want to call it, we can keep that level down, then we're talking about lower environmental impact overall, fewer communities that have to be exposed to extractivism overall. And that's also something to think about.
One other aspect that I would like to add here, and that has particularly struck me, is Jevons paradox. Jevons paradox suggests that improving the energy efficiency of a machine doesn't decrease total energy consumption, it actually increases it. And this happens because more efficient energy use lowers costs, which then boosts demand. And it has been described as early as in the 19th century for steam engines and coal, but it has been remained true until today. More efficient car engines, cars get bigger, etc. So, I mean, this probably works both ways if you get more efficient or if you have more renewable energy. So I wonder, I mean, that seems to be at the core of, or one of the core problems with green growth. But is this like a natural law, or could we avoid it?
Okay, I keep coming back to Bob Ayers, but this is one of his pieces of life work. So I'm very proud to be able to say so Bob Ayers basically, and with his wife, Leslie Ayers, and with his colleague, Ben Moore, they really showed that this is a mechanism of growth. This is productivity. So you can be surprised at Jevons paradox, which has at least 5 different names. It's like Jevons paradox, the rebound effect, the Kazum-Brooks postulate.
Never heard of it.
Is one of my favorite. Oh yeah, Kazum-Brooks. It sounds like a magic formula. But anyway, so the Jevons paradox is not something that we should be surprised at, because in fact, it's how growth happens. So if you know about mainstream macroeconomics, you know that there's a growth production function. So growth should be a function of labor and capital. Like you have more workers in more factories, then you should have more growth. And what you know from the labor capital model is that it cannot explain growth. There's this huge residual. Growth is way bigger than labor and capital can explain. And this is explained by technology, and the person who sort of explained by technology sort of generically, and the person who is called the solo residual for one of the famous economists who studied it. But you can explain the solo residual almost entirely through energy efficiency. So it's just a mechanism of productivity. It's just the way that the economy works is it seeks productivity frontiers and exploits them for growth. And so, yes, it is fundamental to the way our economies work. Our economies naturally seeks out these frontiers, these productivity frontiers, and will bring them back into the machine as an engine for further growth. And that's why I believe, and other people believe, that we need to move away from growth dependencies and growth imperatives and try to have a society that's oriented towards degrowth or post-growth, basically economies and societies that work whether they're growing or not. And that means that we need to tackle these growth imperatives and growth dependencies straight on and try to do things really quite differently, because it's true that business as usual takes us in this direction, both from a question of inequality, wealth accumulation, power of existing industries and their vested interests and their ways of pushing our governments to keep them on the road, despite the fact that they become uneconomical, and also growth and environmental devastation. So we're in this machine that has a certain way of functioning, and what people in the degrowth and post-growth camp, which I certainly am in, are saying is we need to change the machine. We can't keep going with this one.
So you mentioned degrowth and post-growth. Are they synonymous?
Almost, but not quite. So what degrowth describes quite clearly is the need for economies, and in the global north especially, so the US, Canada, Europe, Japan, Australia, the need for them to degrow materially and in terms of the scale of their economic activities in order for the rest of the world to stay within planetary boundaries. So that's a very special, that's clear that certain economies and certain segments, class segments, the wealthiest within those economies need to degrow their activities. So that's sort of one specific thing that degrowth is aiming at. I think post-growth is more general because post-growth encompasses the policies and sort of the state of what an economy would look like after we deal with degrowth. So if we're able to do degrowth, then what does post-growth look like? What does an economy look like that functions whether or not it's growing, where growth is not vital to job creation, pensions, government expenditure, and so on, where we basically function regardless of the direction of the economy. So it's more encompassing.
Okay, and it's post-growth comes after degrowth.
Yeah.
So
or after growth for global South countries. There are a lot of countries that do need to grow. Yeah.
Okay, what I really wonder, you mentioned growth dependence, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think the Western states, or the one you just mentioned, they are dependent on growth, right? Because when the economy contracts, that leads to higher unemployment, lower tax revenues, increases social security costs. And I would say this can lead to civil unrest, for instance.
Oh, absolutely. It can lead to Trump. Let's just look
yes. There has been inflation, and here is Trump, right? This is really my question.
Yeah, absolutely.
Where should we start, or how? Because this dependence is there. I don't know how to put it away.
Yeah. Well, Well, that's exactly the question that is being asked by a lot of people in the degrowth and ecological economics field. So this is exactly what we're doing, is we're basically seeking out growth dependencies, growth imperatives, and coming up with models and policies for dealing with them. In terms of dealing with inflation, you don't even have to go as far as degrowth. I think that there's some economists who are more on the mainstream side who wouldn't necessarily consider themselves ecological economists or degrowthers. But for instance, somebody like Isabella Weber, who's been saying that the U.S. government should act against price gouging. So basically, this happened all over the world. After Corona, or during Corona, during the COVID crisis, a lot of things happened that led to inflation of one kind or another. And then Russia's invasion of Ukraine followed onto that. And these were used as excuses, in some cases valid, in some cases by supermarkets and oil companies and whatever, to raise prices. But those conditions didn't stay around.
Absolutely.
But the high prices stayed around. And so there's this huge price gouging. So a lot of the inflation is actually due to price gouging, basically companies making profit off a crisis. And that should be attacked full frontally. So there should be things like a windfall tax. There should have been a windfall tax against the fossil fuel companies that made hundreds of billions off of the Ukraine invasion and various other things.
I'm not familiar with the term. What's a windfall tax?
So a windfall is when you get a huge amount of profits, the wind pushes all the falling leaves on you. So you get all this money from a windfall. And the thing is, these companies made so much money so fast, and everybody else was losing so much money so fast. So there should have been a windfall tax where the government says, no, you don't get to keep that money because you earned it by price gouging. You earned it by setting prices too high because of a situation of crisis, and now everybody else is hurting, and you need to give that money back. So I think that these are things that you can do without even going towards degrowth. I think we need to remember that our economies could function better in any case on these kinds of topics. But what degrowth is looking at specifically is it's trying to prevent our economies from being structurally dependent on the profit accumulation and the wealth accumulation of the most wealthy. And the way that we do that is we do that by protecting everybody. So some of the main policies that are put forward by degrowth and post-growth are things like a job guarantee. So everybody gets to have a job, everybody gets to have a livelihood. That is something that can be organized, and is something that was organized in previous depressions, for instance, where the government is the employer of last resort. It's something that was put forward in the Green New Deal, Ocasio-Cortez, so that basically you know that people will always be able to have a job in these new green sectors or in the care sectors or somewhere else. So that's job guarantee. That's already a huge help to people in cases of joblessness. You also have combinations of policies like universal basic services, universal basic income, where you're basically ensuring that everybody has a decent minimum to live on that nobody will be in poverty, basically a very strong social safety net that applies to everybody equally. You don't have to like qualify to be in it and then come back out of it and then qualify to be in it again. So you really, you just have a lot of social security in terms of your needs being met. And that means that you're able to do things like eradicate poverty and mean that people can transition from one job to another and get job training without suffering. Economically, for instance, which is a big deal. And so when you do those kinds of things, you're really stopping the dynamics actually of fascism, for instance. You're preventing people from suffering economically. Now, the question is, how do you pay for all these programs? How do you decide how you're going to organize yourself? And here, one of the things that we're also promoting is this idea of economic democracy. So rather than decisions in the market being made by producers, and we didn't have time to get into this, but for instance, car dependency is something that the car industry and the road industry decided for us 100 years ago and rolled out, including rolling out motorways and so on. And they've really changed the way our spaces work in order to make us as dependent on cars as possible, including aspects of financial dependence now. You don't just buy a car, you enter into a debt relationship, etc. So we know that the producers impose dependence on their products. This is known in environmental sociology in the US as the treadmill of production. You have companies that are overproductive that need overconsumption. And that's our society now. That's a big part of growth dependency, is overproduction that needs overconsumption so you don't have a crisis. And one way that we say to get out of that is economic democracy, which means that instead of Volkswagen and Shell and BMW and ExxonMobil and those people deciding how we live our lives, we decide how we live our lives. So we decide if we want public transportation, we decide which jobs we want, which industries we want, how we want to produce things, how we want to consume things. And this is something that can be done, but it does require changing a lot of the ownership structures of our current societies because it's going to piss off the current owners, let's be clear.
Of course. This all sounds very reasonable to me, but I have to admit some of the things you just said, they also remind me a lot of communism, like a job guarantee, etc. So what's the difference between economic democracy and communism?
Well, communism in most of its iterations was extremely undemocratic. So that was one of the interesting things, actually, is if you look at the history of the Russian Revolution, there were these workers' councils and community councils and neighborhood councils, and they were really active sites of people discussing things and wanting emancipation and to do things differently. And it was a beautiful time, and they all got crushed to little bits and pieces, and probably most of them ended up in Gulag. So this idea of economic democracy is really, in fact, trying to go away from these excesses of authoritarian centrally planned economies. So we need some kind of planning, because we need to stay within planetary boundaries. Like, you can't just do that by chance. You have to have some kind of sense of where we're going, what our targets are in terms of resource use, what our targets are in terms of technology development. We need some kind of direction. But then how we get there, how it interferes with our lives, how we implement it, how we work towards it, we should be making those decisions ourselves as much of a local level as possible. So that's very different. This idea that you really want people as community members, as citizens, as consumers, as workers, to be making really strong decisions for their daily life. No, it sounds like a lot of meetings, also when you put it that way. People are like, oh my God, I'm going to have to go to all these meetings. But that's part of work. That's part of the work of being a grown-up in an autonomous, emancipated society, is you got to make decisions, right? And not everybody has to make all of the decisions. So one way to think about it is, you'd have your normal job of some description, and then you'd also have part of your time would be on working as, it's a recognized part of your activity, is working on the water board or working on the public transportation board or the education board, whatever it is, that you're basically engaging in these decision-making activities as part of your job of adult in that society. So in that sense, it's very different from communism. I mean, the idea of going towards more equality and having a system that serves the 99% rather than the 1%, this is clearly aligned with communism and socialism and leftist ideas. Like, let us be clear. But it's very, very different from the authoritarian communism that was pioneered by the USSR and then taken over, copied everywhere else. There was this idea that you really needed an authoritarian system to face various challenges, and that ended in disaster, environmentally as well, obviously, right? Mm-hmm. And the other thing is, democracy is necessary for environmental quality. Every time you have environmental impacts, you have certain people who suffer from it in terms of their kids, their health, their community, their daily life. And so having democracy is essential for the rights of those people to be recognized and for them to have good conditions of life. So that's another reason that democracy is essential from an environmental perspective.
Mm-hmm. And I think this idea of having decisions at the most local level possible is also very central to that,
Yeah.
right? So another point that seems important to me is this planning mentioned. I mean, so who gets to decide what the limits are and how we allocate resources? Do you have any solutions yet? I mean, you don't have to know it all. But
so we have some level of proposals and some level of experiments already. So I think that basically these are things that obviously planetary boundaries, you can't just go around and ask people, round 20 people up in your neighborhood and say, okay, decide about planetary boundaries, because you need expert knowledge. I think that there's sort of an illusion that democracy should just work perfectly, but democracy needs training, right? People need to be educated in how to behave in meetings and how to discuss things and come to consensus. And if you're taking decisions on a specific topic, you need to be trained to have some level of expertise in that topic, because otherwise you can't do your job. And so around planetary boundaries and climate and biodiversity and all the other environmental challenges that we're facing, or crises that we're facing, not just challenges, sadly. I think that here, the structure of citizen assemblies that are informed by experts is really promising. And I've been part of several citizen assemblies, citizen juries, as an expert on climate. And I have to say that this is one of the reasons that I now want to work on economic democracy, because it gave me fantastic amounts of faith and confidence in our fellow humans. Like, people are really good at taking stuff seriously. They're really good at asking questions. They're really good at discussing amongst themselves. I mean, we have hundreds of thousands of years of evolution of us communally deciding stuff. We're actually very good at it if you give us half a chance. We're much better at that than at being consumers. And so this idea of interaction between experts and citizens actually works quite well. And when it's run in a good format, obviously you can have a bad format if you let lots of industry lobbyists in as experts. That tends not to work so well. But when those interactions are allowed to happen well, the citizen assemblies come up with very good programs that are generally a lot more ambitious and a lot more far-reaching than what the governments propose. And then the governments tend to reject them. But I mean, I was in Leeds, a small, generally poor town in the north of England that is very far away from, London and the centers of power. And it has an airport, which is one thing that people sort of are proud of and use to go on holidays and see them as connecting to the rest of the world. The citizen jury in Leeds, they were like, oh, yeah, of course we need to close the airport. They saw a different future for themselves, and they saw a different way forward than what the government was seeing. And these were really representative people, including overrepresentation of people who knew nothing about climate or who were climate deniers to start with. So I see promise in these democratic processes that are in dialogue with experts and where people can ask questions transparently, like, what does this actually mean? How do you actually know this? What's your proof? These are all legitimate questions that we need to be able to communicate and answer.
I was just thinking that it's sad that people who listen to the podcast can't see the video, because the confidence when you were speaking about these experiences, it really shows also in your face. That was very beautiful. But I have a follow-up question, right? Because we were now discussing that we should have decisions at the most local level possible. But then we are talking about planetary boundaries.
Yeah.
So this is at a global level.
Yeah.
Because people in Leeds can't decide
absolutely
on what their fair share is. So how should this work?
So here there's different proposals that are made. I mean, we wrote with one of my colleagues in Leeds, Dan O'Neill, we wrote one of the first papers where we downscaled planetary boundaries to the national level, and we did it on a per capita basis. We were basically like, we're all equal on planet Earth, so let's just start with that and just say how much resource use that corresponds to per capita. I think that's certainly one way forward. There are other ways that would basically take into account historic legacies. So in the global north, there's some countries where you have a lot more infrastructure. Like, I look around me and I see, we have roads, we have buildings, we have all kinds of stuff. We have networks that exist that are already in place. And so we should allow more planetary boundary space to areas that don't have that infrastructure, for instance, and where they still need to build it up. And so that would be another way of compensating. But there are a lot of researchers that are actively working on this. And I think that the fair thing for a citizen assembly or a decision-making organization to do is to basically look at what the alternatives are, see what the different levels look like, and then decide, okay, well, we think that for us, what we think we can do now is we can deal with this target. And all the targets are extremely ambitious. I mean, that's the thing, is that it's not that if you use one method, you're going to have 5 times more planetary space or emissions or land use or whatever. Everything is very constrained. So we're really talking about everybody actively moving as fast as possible. And as somebody who's been in the climate space for a while and in the IPCC and all of that, I'm a bit really sick of these targets. Like, oh, this level by 2030, this level by 2050, when what we need to be doing is forget about the targets. We need to be ramping down fossil fuel use as fast as possible. So we need to be stopping stuff now, ramping stuff down now, and ramping other stuff up. And just let's do it as fast as we can and see where we get, rather than set a target and proceed to do nothing, which is what has been happening for as long as I've been looking at this, and even longer, let's say since at least 1990, that everybody's focused on targets, but not focused on just transforming our existing system as fast as possible.
So, but maybe I've missed that point. If you already have an idea about what that would also mean at an institutional level, like would there be some United Nations Global Resources Board or...
That already exists. There's the International Resource Panel that looks at material use and metal use and so on.
But that had the legitimacy and power or...
So power within the United Nations, I mean, this is one of the sad things, right? The only organization that really has power is the World Trade Organization, and they're happy to see the planet burn in various ways that are terrible. So I think in terms of an international body, I think that having the IPCC informing policy and the International Resource Panel is interesting too. The IPBES on biodiversity. So we have these scientific bodies that are basically making guidance all the time and informing us all the time. I don't see any reason that we need something more, yet more. They're great. Let's keep them and make them stronger. In terms of taking things seriously, I think that's up to every locality in every country. Right now, we don't have we don't have a body that would be capable of imposing conditions on others. Not within the UN. The UN is not binding. That's the thing, is the only organization that we have that's really binding internationally is the World Trade Organization, and they're terrible. So
what you're saying is maybe we don't even need something that is binding, because people should...
Yeah, we should be acting. Anybody who cares about this, we can't... We've been playing this game since the Kyoto Protocol of waiting for one person to act, for the other person to act. It's also within the Paris Agreement. You have one level of ambition if you're the only one working, and another level of ambition if other people are doing stuff. This idea that you only do something if somebody else does it too, I think is not defensible anymore. I think that anybody with a conscience and an awareness, any government with a conscience and an awareness of how terrible all of these things will be for their own population, and it's going to be terrible for everybody all over the world. We know this. We see the disasters from Valencia to Indonesia to everywhere that's been facing, extreme weathers and events linked to climate, is that we just need to act super fast, and that action is not detrimental to our local population because we have technological alternatives. And we can invest in our own people, in our own workers, in our own workforce to implement these. So, for instance, one of the magical technologies that we have available to us are heat pumps for heating or cooling. They're just this great thing, right? And it's not super high tech. It's not
the
like
technology has been there for decades, I would say.
Yeah, and so why is not everybody just like rolling, this is an industry that every single country could develop for themselves, is putting together these things and rolling them out, training people to make it as cheap as possible. And or another one is insulating buildings. We're talking about making people's lives more secure and cheaper and less reliant on volatile foreign fuels that are also destroying our planet's ability to support human life. This should be a no-brainer for any government, The problem is that the governments are very much captured by fossil fuel industry, both in reality and in also by lobbying. They're not given these alternative ideas at the same level. But if you look at the alternatives we have, the alternatives in terms of energy efficiency and sufficiency and alternative production, heat pumps, renewable energy, these things are great. We can just do it. And it's less costly than fossil fuels. The price of solar photovoltaic has dropped below the price of fossil fuel generation. They're so cheap. And then people are still having a discussion about nuclear. This is way cheaper than nuclear. I don't know why we're still discussing it. Like just economically. And if you look at things like the food sector, because another big driver of planetary breakdown and biodiversity loss and planetary boundary breaching, as well as greenhouse gases and climate change, is the agricultural sector, specifically meat and dairy. And there again, we have the most common and deadly cancer in our societies is colon cancer, which vegetarians don't get. And cardiovascular disease.
I just want to mention we have an episode with Jérôme Santolini about this very topic.
Okay, great. So you have cancer and cardiovascular disease that are linked to unhealthy diets, as well as obesity and other health issues, diabetes as well. All of these things can be reduced, if not eliminated, in some cases, by having a plant-based diet. So a healthy plant-based diet solves so many different issues. Why aren't governments pushing that forward? It's because of the power of industrial lobbies that are basically preventing them from doing the right thing, both for their own population and for the long-term health of the planet. So I think that this question that we need to wait for others to act, I would push back against that. I think that everybody could be acting right now.
And you would say we should stop looking for a body that can enforce things, but rather go for a true bottom-up approach. Is that what you're saying? Yeah.
Yes, because when you ask citizens, so when you ask people, so first of all, we can see that climate and ecological crises are really very high on people's list of topics that they're very concerned about, but they're not necessarily seeing the political program that aligns with that in terms of them being able to really push forward and act on it. So when you ask people what kind of future they want through these citizens' assemblies or in general, what you see is that people really want to do something different. They really want that possibility. And I think one of the problems now is that the environmental movement and the socialist or equality movement have sort of been pitted against, or worker movement have sort of been pitted against each other in a way that's completely counterproductive. And so what people do, they're thinking, there's sort of this false dichotomy between we need to do something that's good for society and we need to do something that's good for the environment. And the lack of a coherent program is what's causing a lot of the friction and a lot of the headway for far right and climate denying movements, et cetera, to take place. So I think that there's sort of a political aspect to it, but I see no reason why each individual country, each individual locality would not be excited to move forward and do some of these things on its own.
You have a project that is titled Living Well Within Limits, and we haven't explicitly spoken about it yet. Maybe, these were ideas out of the project. I don't know. Can you maybe share some of the insights from the project?
Yeah, so I have to thank the Leverhulme Trust. They funded this project against all the odds. It sounded crazy in the UK, but they were looking for crazy projects. And so I was really happy to have them support me. And we did great things. So this project is now over, but what we were able to do is that it is possible for everybody to live well within planetary boundaries using much less resources than we do now, much less energy than we do now. We were really able to show that some aspects of governance and political systems really help people live better lives at low resource use. That's something that we can observe right now. Some of the factors that really help are things like equality and public service availability. Public services are key. Public services are vital because public services are really how we protect each other. And so education, healthcare, networked infrastructure, like public services are the best. And democracy, it turns out, is good too. Also, we found some negative factors like extractivism and economic growth. So economies dependent on extraction don't do well. And economies that are above a certain income that are still growing, that are still pursuing economic growth, are doing it to the detriment of their own population's well-being and of resource use. Yeah. So we were able to show those kinds of things. We were able to look at inequality in a lot more detail. We were able to show that the inequality in resource use comes a lot from the transport sector. So the dwelling sector and the food sector are much more equally distributed than transport. So you really see richer people within countries and around the world have bigger cars, change cars more often, drive more frequently, longer distances, take the plane a lot more. So all of that, we were really able to see that worldwide. What else? Oh, yeah, and we also investigated aspects of neoliberalism and aspects of car dependency, how the automotive industry is sort of pushing car dependency onto the rest of us. So we were able to look at the political economy aspects as well. And so we were able to do all of that, and we were very happy to do so. And I think we really brought things forward quite a bit in terms of the results we were able to get, and to give people a different idea of how to look at the economy, that you look at the economy from the perspective of the well-being of the population, that this is something you can do without being crazy. You don't have to think about, giving people happy pills or, I don't know. That it's really about providing people with the right material and social conditions to be free of deprivation mainly. So once people's needs are satisfied, it turns out people are fine. Like overconsumption doesn't help. And what it means to have your needs satisfied is it means that you can make life plans. It basically means that you can have projects. You can decide what you want to do, and you can try doing it. And that's what people really want. Is that's what makes life worth living. Autonomy, agency. Yeah, pursuing, because if your needs are not satisfied, then you're really in this situation of deprivation that is harming your life chances, right? And then you're constantly going to be stressed and worried about that, and that's going to ruin your life. And that's what we see happening to pretty much everybody in the U.S. in terms of healthcare, lack of social security. I mean, it's just a horrible. I'm part American, and I am American, and I lived in the U.S. for a while, and it's an awful place. I remember I had a colleague who moved to Switzerland, and he said, it's the first time I feel like I can breathe. Just because of the social security. It really changes things. So if you're able to be okay and pursue your life ideas, then great. So we were able to study this, and now we're carrying some of these ideas forward in the REAL project. So it's called REAL, a post-growth deal is its full name, with the funded by the European Union. And the colleagues there are Yorgos Kallis and Jason Hickel in Barcelona.
So I have to admit, I'm surprised how hopeful you seem to me. I mean, as you mentioned that that it can be very frustrating to be in the climate movement. So that's my question. What are your hopes for the future?
So I'm not hopeful in terms of the reality of us being able to change our systems, because right now we're facing powers that are very entrenched. And I mean, if you look at the COP29 in Baku, I mean, I don't even know how people still put up with this process. They are saints. Basically you have the literally capture of the climate diplomacy by the fossil fuel companies. And this is the second year that the head of the COP is also like doing fossil fuel deals on the side, as Justin Rowlatt showed from the BBC. So the realpolitik of what's facing us is really depressing and really fixed, but I think we're learning more and more about it. And I think that one of the things that my research has taught me is that we are definitely capable of doing things completely differently. There is nothing in our human nature, our capacity of organization, our capacity of technological deployment or of decision-making that makes us unable to do things differently. We're really being stopped from doing these new things by the powers in place. And so the question is whether or not people are going to be able to realize what we're up against quickly enough and fight it off quickly enough. So I think that the obstacles are huge, but I am very much persuaded that another world is out there that we could manage very differently, safely and with more prosperity, better health, and without destroying our life conditions with the planet. The question of getting there, I think, is very difficult.
Thanks for granting us a glimpse into that alternative world. Much needed. Thank you so much, Julia Steinberger.
Thanks, Tom.
In 2 weeks, we will talk with Jérôme Santolini about the curing of meat with nitrites, a technique that is still pervasive even though we know it causes cancer. Beyond the Fix is brought to you by Critical Scientists Switzerland, an independent network of Swiss researchers, and is made possible by the Stiftung Mercator Schweiz. Music by Mich Gerber.